For player profiles, in-depth features, and exclusive interviews, visit sfhandbook.com to learn more about the best young football players in the world. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Scouted Football Podcast once again. Really looking forward to introducing a new series and a new guest to you all today. First off though, the series, as you may have guessed due to the title, is to do with the 2022 World Cup in Qatar next year. We'll be looking at individual players, under 23 case studies and that sort of thing from each confederation. We're getting started with CONMEBOL, which many of you will be familiar with as the footballing confederation in South America, their version of UEFA, if you will. For that reason, there was nobody else we could kick off the new series with to discuss South American football other than Tim Vickery. Tim is based in Rio de Janeiro and contributes regularly to the BBC, ESPN, World Soccer, Sports Illustrated, among many others, on the topic of South American football, of course. Tim, thank you very much for your time. Welcome to the Scouted Football Podcast. How are you doing?
Lovely to be here. In the famous words of former US President Jimmy Carter, away the lads.
Very topical indeed. You've clearly done your homework on me, haven't you? I mean, it's with CONMEBOL, with the latest round of fixtures in World Cup qualifying. It was quite an exciting, action-packed last round, as is always the case, to be honest. Not quite as dramatic as the COVID-related public health pitch invasion that happened during the September internationals, but I'm sure we'll get onto that at some point. First off, though, CONMEBOL, obviously the confederation, which is home to your Brazils, your Argentinas, Uruguay, Colombia, some of the world's best, most talented players, some would say ever. What's it like sort of covering football from that part of the world?
Well, the thing I like best is exactly that, the World Cup qualification campaign. Because I know you lot over there, you hate, most of you hate the FIFA dates. It kind of interrupts the whole rhythm of your football watching. But for the rest of the world, remember what it's like for the rest of the world. It's the only time really we get to see the players. They come back and they play in really competitive games. South American World Cup qualifying is terrific. I think it's the best on the planet. All 10 teams go into the competition thinking that they can qualify, and that wasn't always the case. It's been greatly improved since the change of format in 1996. Since then, we've had all 10 countries playing against each other home and away, just making use of the same FIFA dates that Europe uses for its Euro qualifiers and its World Cup qualifiers, if you like, because our regional competition, the Copa America, doesn't have qualifiers. So it's a marathon, and having that marathon since '96 has, for the first time, put the South American national teams on a kind of level playing field with Europe in the sense that they have a calendar of competitive games with guaranteed income and the chance to keep a side together. And before that, there were often huge gaps in international football in South America. National teams would go like 2 years without playing a game, and kind of everything was done on the basis of a tournament. Like even World Cup qualification was done very quickly on the basis of a tournament. Since we've had this, and since sides have been able to invest in coaches, and this is absolutely crucial, invest in their under-20 structure. It's absolutely crucial to an understanding of South American football, the under-20s. Since then, we've seen a dramatic improvement in the standards of the lesser nations. And Ecuador had never qualified for a World Cup. They'd never actually played a full international in Europe until they qualified for their first ever World Cup in 2002. 2006, they made the second round and they gave England a game. That was unthinkable 30 years earlier, 20 years earlier. They were a Luxembourg, before the mid 80s. They were a Luxembourg. Look at the progress that they'd made. 2010 was the best World Cup in the history of Paraguay, who gave Spain a hell of a game. 2014 was the best World Cup in the history of Colombia. 10 and 14 were the best ever in the history of Chile, with the exception of 62 that they hosted. Peru came back to the competition in 18 and for the first time since 82 and were competitive. And Uruguay have come back to football's top table. In two of the
Mm.
last three World Cups, statistically, they've been South America's best team. And that in the mid 90s, that would have seemed absolutely inconceivable. So it's a great competition, South America's World Cup qualifiers. It's one I love. Followed closely actually by the South American Under-20 Championships, which can drag because it's a lot of games.
Hmm.
But that's where you get to see some real jewels, and it's the conveyor belt to the senior side. So that they're the favourite things that I do really from South American football, because the club game has been gutted, because the best players are moving abroad ever younger. There are still there's great tradition there. And now, especially in Brazil, there's a handful of super clubs in Brazil who can now afford better players. The tactic is really sell your young stars to Europe and use that to finance squads of either players who are coming back from finishing off their career in Europe, or the likes of, say, Andreas Pereira,
Hmm.
who wasn't getting a regular game and can be a star back at home. So you bring him back. So that there are always points of interest in the club game, but it's the national team game, both in the World Cup qualifiers and in the under-20s, that I find most fascinating.
Yeah, I mean that's a lovely little sort of colourful introduction to the Confederation, to the World Cup qualifying structure in South America, and I think that just to brief everybody sort of on the current standings, you've got Brazil who are top, who are unbeaten on 31 points so far, Argentina second with 25, and then Ecuador, as you mentioned, which might be somewhat surprising to some people, but we'll get on to why that might be the case, that they're in third with 17 points, with a little case study in a short while, but. Then you've got your Colombia on 16, Uruguay in fifth on 16, and Chile then on 13 in sixth. It's obviously the four teams go through automatically to the World Cup, and then the team that finishes fifth, they'll then enter sort of the playoff structure where you then end up having to play teams from other confederations. I remember, was it Uruguay played Australia was it for the
Couple of
2000?
times.
Yeah,
Couple of
yeah.
times, yeah. They beat them to get to 2002 and
Mhm.
lost to them on penalties in 2006.
Yes, that's the one I'm remembering, 2006. Yeah, because I knew there was some sort of high drama that happened between those two teams, that definitely wasn't at a finals. But on to sort of the last round of matches, and I think it was pretty much dominated by the decisions that Tite made. Certainly from a Brazilian perspective, there was the games against Venezuela and Colombia, which obviously Brazil won against Venezuela, and then they drew 0-0 in Barranquilla, was it? I think.
Yeah.
And then went into their final game in Manaus against Uruguay, and that was where Leeds United player Raphinha made his full debut. He'd obviously came off the bench in the two previous matches, but his is an interesting case. And while I don't always make exceptions for 24-year-olds on the Scouted podcast, I think I do have to make an exception for Raphinha, given that the nature of his introduction to the Brazilian national team, to Selecao, was so impactful. All those images of him arm in arm with Neymar after the Uruguay game. It's just, I couldn't help but sort of consume everything that was being written about it, because
Hmm.
it's such a good story. Didn't play a professional game when he was in his home country, before getting a move to Victoria Guimarães, in, I think it was around 2016. So as you were saying earlier, Tim, when the players come back, it's sort of the first and only real opportunity that lots of people will get to see these types of players. And especially in Raphinha's case, that's only amplified by the fact that he wasn't a professional in the top flight in Brazil, or even in the state championships. I'm just curious to know, what was known of Raphinha before this most recent round of fixtures, or the one previous where he was initially called up.
Yeah, when he was called up for September and then not
Mm,
released. There are a lot of Premier League fans in Brazil, and not
mm,
as many, I think, as you probably get in Africa and Asia, because domestic football is still by far the main driver over here, the local clubs. But I think the vast majority of Brazil's football public didn't really know who he was, and wouldn't have recognised him had they met him in the street when he came off the bench at half time against Venezuela to make his international debut. They knew all about him by the end of the 45 minutes, because as debuts go, it wasn't good. It was sensational. This again, this reflects on the quality of South America's World Cup qualification. Everything's gone wrong for Venezuela in this campaign. It's been a nightmare for them, but they were leading Brazil 1-0 for an hour, and without the introduction of Raphinha, I think Venezuela might have won that game. Raphinha, he was just sensational right from the start. The first thing that caught the attention with him was his set pieces, and the corners were terrific. And it was Brazil weren't creating anything, and it was obvious that the way they were going to get their equaliser was from a headed goal from a centre back from one of Raphinha's set pieces, and that's the way that it came. And then at 1-1 with Venezuela trying to force the second goal, and the space opens up. Then you began to see the winger, and Brazil went ahead with a penalty, and it was all about him. He carried the ball at pace for a long run, and they just played the simple pass with the right weight at the right time. So often you see those counterattacks wasted. And that set up a penalty. And then in stoppage time, he set up the third goal, getting to the byline and pushing across. Came off the bench for the last half hour away to Colombia. I was surprised they waited so long. And he was the best thing on the field then as well. He very, very nearly set up the winner. And then, given his debut against Uruguay, it was Brazil's best performance for years, actually. I think probably since about 2017, 2016. It was the moment that they found the blend, and he linked up instantly with Neymar. They were terrific together, and they've found themselves a player. So if the Brazilian football public didn't know him when he came on at halftime against Venezuela, they know much more about him now.
Yeah, it certainly seems unfathomable that next year in Qatar that Raphinha won't be there because the impact that as you just alluded to. I think I stayed up over here in the UK. I stayed up to watch that Colombia game, and it was when he came on and just absolutely rinsed Johan Mojica, the Colombia left
He
back.
destroyed him, didn't he?
Oh, it
He
was.
turned him into toast. Mojica just couldn't cope with him at all. It was remarkable to see. I mean, the coach Chichi, he made a point after the Uruguay game of saying, "Let's go calm with him. He is going to oscillate. It ain't going to be like this all the time." And I think that was a recognition of just how sensational he'd been in those first three matches.
Yeah, I think when you have to say that after, I mean, when you have to temper the expectations after such a grand introduction, that's kind of told you how integral that he could become in future. And obviously, he's still only 24 years old. I think he turns 25 in December. So he'll still be 25 when the World Cup rolls around. So got quite a few competitions and Copa Americas and the like in his legs, definitely. There was another sort of, I mean, especially from sort of the Anglo-centric viewpoint that I'm sort of taking this from, but there was another big story. I don't know. I'm quite keen to gauge how big a story it's been in South America as well, because over here it's kind of bubbled away, but it's been one which has been so many people's favorite tale from the international break, because they're much maligned, these breaks, especially in Europe, and while I think that's very unfair sometimes, I think international football often offers up the best and most sort of heartwarming storylines. I think this one in particular with Ben Brereton Díaz with Chile, it has been just absolutely phenomenal. And I was watching the commentary of the goal that he scored. I think it was against Paraguay, but you might have to correct me, in the most recent round. And it was just the commentator going, "G, Ben, Ben, Ben," and it sounds so strange to hear it from a Hispanic commentator. But it's and you're like, that guy plays for Blackburn in the Championship. It's so surreal, isn't it?
Yeah, and he scored a cracker against Venezuela in the last game as well, and the commentator just kept on shouting over and over again, "Benito, Benito, Benito Diaz, Big Ben, Big Ben."
Big Ben, that's it.
Yeah, they've really taken to him because he's exactly what they need. I mean, Chilean domestic football is a disaster. It's not producing anyone, So you look at the national team, and it's still Alexis Sanchez, Arturo Vidal, Gary Medel, Mauricio Isla, Claudio Bravo, Charles Aranguiz. The base of the team is the lot who came through the under-20s in 2007. That's nearly 15 years ago. They missed out on the last World Cup because that generation aged together and they ran out of steam, and they haven't produced anyone since. When he was first called up, again, this is the Chilean public had no idea who he was, and he doesn't speak the language. And they make a big thing of singing the national anthem, and when the music stops, they carry it on a cappella. Obviously, he can't do that, so he just has to concentrate on a solemn expression as the camera pans down. But in the international language of football, he's exactly what they need, because he's youth and he's thrust and he's power and he's a smile on his face. And you saw in the Copa America that he had plenty to add. And then he was another one that they couldn't get hold of in September for those 3 rounds in September. And they badly missed him. They only scored 1 goal in 3 games. And then they had those 2 must-win games at home to Paraguay and Venezuela. And he came up big and he scored crackers in both of them. So he's an absolute cult figure. They love him. And this is one of those stories where international football is doing club football a favour.
Definitely.
When he was first called up, and I was, went to social media to ask about him, and Blackburn fans were telling me, he's a disappointment. He's clearly intimidated by the amount of money that Rovers have paid for him from Notts Forest. Getting into the Chile side and seeing that he can cope in that company has obviously done wonders for his confidence, and Blackburn are now the beneficiaries.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think with the stage that he's now on, compared to no disrespect to Blackburn fans, but compared to obviously the national stadium in Chile to Ewood Park, when you've got an entire stadium, all the commentary positions, chanting your name, it's something which it's only going to invigorate you, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, they haven't used the national stadium for
Oh, have
these
they
2
not?
rounds. No, they went to Catolica's ground because it's so compact. They won these games on atmosphere as much as anything. So no, it's not the big stadium. It's a much smaller stadium, because now, and this was really apparent in these 3 rounds. The fans are back, and it made a difference. We had 3 rounds. That's 15 games. In only 3 of those games did the away side manage to score a single goal. The other
Wow.
12, the away side didn't get a goal. Home advantage matters in South America.
Yeah, and I suppose one of those was Uruguay and Manaus, wasn't it? And that was
Consolation,
sort of, yeah,
just a
complete, yeah.
consolation. Yeah.
Wow. Well, there you have it then. So that's sort of the lowdown on how Ben Brereton, or Big Ben as he's now been termed, is has been received down in South America. But you mentioned obviously he wasn't available for the September internationals, and nor was Raphinha or the many of the other Brazilian players in the Premier League. But that was mainly to do with, obviously, it was COVID related and public health officials, and there was obviously that all came to a head. That very dramatic, the public health pitch invasion that occurred in the Brazil-Argentina game. I mean, I think a lot of people saw that, but maybe didn't understand the reason for why that happened, and why is it uniquely South America where that might happen.
Well, I think that there's lots of things going together to form that one. And Brazil had changed the regulations since the Copa America. And the whole red list thing on Brazil at that time was on the UK's red list. So we're going to reciprocate. UK's on our red list as well. No. So there's aspects of that. Argentina had been informed. Whether they'd been informed clearly enough, I don't know. If they'd had applied for an exemption before arriving in Brazil, I don't think it would have been a problem, but they didn't. And that means that they went through the airport and kind of hid the fact that some of those players had been in the UK within the previous 10 days. What happened here, I don't think it's got anything to do with really the Bolsonaro government or with Brazil looking to gain an advantage. Look at the league table. Look at the South American table. They don't need an advantage. I don't think it's got anything to do with that. But there is, and I've seen plenty of this in my time here, and this is not necessarily a criticism, but there is a side of Brazilian authority that resents more than anything else the idea that Brazil is a country where anything goes. They just that drives them apoplectic. So it was obvious on the day before the game. It was obvious that there was a problem. That Argentina, that the players, the 4 English-based players, hadn't declared this at the airport that they'd been in England, so that the health authorities there were running around trying trying to get them to sign documents and trying to sort this out, and they could never. They were getting a runaround, frankly. And I think they just got pissed off. We've been given a runaround. Argentina were asked to apply for a last minute exemption. That failed to come through 50 minutes before the kickoff. At which point, they're already in the stadium and they've handed in the team lineup.
Exactly, yeah.
And so that the health officials who said they couldn't gain access to the dressing room, that was all locked up. So what they did was wandered onto the field. It was over officious. They were upholding the law. But it was over officious. I don't really think, especially for all of the players in question were fully vaccinated. I don't really think there was any extra health risk from playing that. Let the game go ahead and then deal with it back at the airport where they had to go anyway and went straight after the game. So there was a huge cocktail of bad communication and over officiousness and lack of common sense. And now there's just no idea what we're going to do with that game, because there's just not space in the calendar to do it. And thankfully, it's not going to matter in terms of World Cup qualification. No one has, in the history of the competition, no one has ever failed to qualify with 28 points. And Brazil already have 31 and Argentina already have 25, and there are lots of rounds to go. So it's not going to matter in terms of qualification. What on earth FIFA are going to do with this game, I don't know.
Yeah, it has created a bit of a maelstrom there, hasn't it? If the initial uprising wasn't enough, but yeah, that was the four Argentine players that obviously had played in the Premier League in the previous round of fixtures. It seemed farcical to suggest that, given the rules that were in place, that you could get away with the fact that, well, maybe they weren't in the UK when Gio Lo Celso and Emi Martinez, Emi Buendia all been pictured in at Villa Park and places like that.
Yeah, and put photos of themselves on social media flying back from defying their clubs and flying back from England. So quite what went on at the airport. How this got through at the airport, I don't really know. And to general mystery, Brazil, the health authorities issued a statement saying the Argentine FA official who'd signed this declaration at the airport, Fernando Batista, the under-20 coach, he wasn't even there. So there's lots of strange things going on in this in this story.
A communications disaster, I think, is how we're gonna sum it up. But back to sort of the football and what's happening on the pitch. And obviously, we mentioned there, obviously Brazil, Argentina, and the two teams who look destined for a place at Qatar 2022. But beneath them, it's far from a foregone conclusion. Ecuador currently in third with 17 points, but tailed quite closely by Colombia, Uruguay, and a little further back, Chile. But with Ecuador, you touched on it earlier, and you also spoke about the under-20s, and that's something I really wanted to go into a little bit of depth on, especially on this podcast, of course, because we watched the under-20 World Cup in 2019 with a real keenness, and Ecuador finishing third at that competition. Were one of the most entertaining sides, and
they were South American champions as well.
Well, exactly, so, going into that competition, they came with a reputation, and it was pretty clear to see. And I've got listed down here. I don't know whether, I think a few of them, maybe Gonzalo Plata had made his senior debut before that competition, but 8 of the 21 in that squad are now, as of the last round of matches, full debutants, which I think is probably the highest rate of return of any squad at that 2019 Under-20 World Cup. So that shows that, I mean, first of all, it's definitely a pathway there, but also, again, it speaks to the level of importance that the Sudamericano Under-20 or Sub-20, the importance that holds in South America. But from a young player's perspective, Tim, I mean, the 2002 and 2006 World Cups for Ecuador were probably, the highlights of their international footballing career. So, or international footballing story so far, given that it was back-to-back World Cups. It was the first time they'd qualified in 2002. But from an individual player's perspective, would you be so bold to say that perhaps the group that we are seeing at the moment could be described as a potentially golden generation of Ecuadorian football?
Perhaps, perhaps, there are some interesting things going on in Ecuadorian football, despite everything. It lives in administrative chaos. There was a huge fuss when there was a kind of coup inside the Ecuadorian FA, and for a while it wasn't clear who the president of the Ecuadorian FA was. They had an expensive rebranding where they switched a very interesting badge for a very shit one. They hired Jordi Cruyff briefly as a high-profile
Yes,
European coach,
I
and
saw that. That's so odd.
he resigned before he'd even taken over a game. But and if you look at club level, despite everything, there's interesting things going on. Barcelona of Guayaquil have been, since the Copa Libertadores, our Champions League, since it's been a year-long thing. It was expanded in 2017 from being pushed into the first half of the year to year long, which is, it's definitely benefited the wealthier clubs from the wealthier countries. Barcelona of Guayaquil are the only side from outside Brazil and Argentina who've made two semi-finals. And Guayaquil is sea level. You can't pin that one on the altitude of Quito. But that's remarkable. In Ecuador at club level is consistently outproducing Colombia. Colombia is so much bigger and, has so many more urban centers. Independiente del Valle from the outskirts of Quito are a model club in terms of youth development. They take it really seriously. And investors have gone there because they have seen the raw material potential of the young Ecuadorian footballer. And Independiente del Valle are producing, selling, on and on and on it goes. So that there are some really interesting players coming out of Ecuadorian football, and I was a big fan of that under 20 generation. Interestingly, at the start of last year, we had the under 23 tournament back, the Olympic qualifiers, where in the Olympic Games you can have some ringers in, but for the qualification tournament it is only under 23. And Ecuador basically took their under 20 side, that side that you're talking about, who had been third in 2019. They took that side, and it didn't work for them at all. Which I suppose one of the points here is the under 20 is vital. And this was the first under 23 that we'd had since 2004. So, for all of those years, the closest thing that we had to the senior side was the under 20s. And under 20s, they have taken on extreme importance in South American football. The big thing behind the return of Uruguay is this nearly 16-year reign of coach Oscar Washington Tabárez that nearly ended at the weekend. He got the dreaded vote of confidence, meaning that he was very close to being sacked and will be sacked, I think, if they don't get good results in two very difficult games next month. But the big thing that he has introduced is the under-20 project, and it's based on a realization of the effect of globalization. Uruguay is an extreme example because it's only a population of just over 3 million. So in a global market, Uruguay cannot possibly compete.
Yeah.
In the old days, before TV, when it was like 50,000 in the stadium watching Peñarol or Nacional, they can compete with 50,000 in the stadium watching Real Madrid. It's the same thing, and they could compete with anyone. Once it becomes TV, Uruguay just doesn't have the market to compete. So they're going to inevitably, the best players are going to leave at a younger, ever younger age. So the thing of Tabárez was, right, we're going to use the under 20s, and what we're going to do is us, the Uruguayan FA, we are going to identify players good enough for modern globalized football. That means players with speed of thought, speed of movement, and speed of technical execution. And then we're going to give them, on the basis that if they're any good, they're inevitably going to go abroad young. We're going to give them an intense course in the history, the traditions, and the identity of the Uruguay shirt. So it's a bit like the Jesuits, we've got them for life, and Uruguay, they've just had this conveyor belt. no, despite having such a small population, they've been able to replace and replace and replace and replace. And it's very interesting to me that a lot of the things that Gareth Southgate has been doing with the England national team seem to be in some ways modelled on what Uruguay have been doing. And England never used to take those youth competitions, the under-17 World Cup, the under-20 World Cup. They never used to take them seriously. They do now. This is where Uruguay are getting their players from, and other countries have seen this and thought, well, we'll have some of that. We'll do that. And Ecuador, with this impressive youth work that some of the clubs are doing, the FA have also got into the act, and that generation, yeah, it does look very promising. But as I say, the gap between under 20s and the senior side is still big. So some of the most important players haven't been able to make that gap yet. I mean, the under 20 side that you mentioned, one of the best, but delightful little player to watch was the little left-footed playmaker, Reza Bala.
Mm-hmm.
He's
Yes, I remember.
very physically fragile, and he's struggled to make the move up. Another one who was great there was the left-footed centre forward, Campana, who Wolves picked up.
Yes.
But he's not quite physical enough. He's not there. And so he struggled. They tried to fast track him into the national team, and it hasn't really worked. And he's been bouncing around from club to club. So it's an imperfect process. Not everyone comes through. If you look at Ecuador now, I think they could certainly do with players in those positions better than some of the ones that they've got. And Angel Mena has been a revelation in these qualifiers, but he's getting on a little bit. Enna Valencia and Estrada up front, I think that can be improved on. But yeah, there are plenty of promising players in other positions, and it does seem to be a very, very interesting generation that's coming through.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Independiente del Valle then, and it, sort of a light bulb came on in my head, and I was thinking, which players do I know? And it was like, oh, Moises Caicedo, of course,
Exactly.
Piero Hincapi, and it got me back thinking to the under 20 Libertadores. Was it 2019 or 20 when they won? And to think that for a prestigious tournament like that, for an Ecuadorian team to be lifting the title over some of the the bigger teams in Argentina and Brazil with the resources that would just dwarf those of an under 20 team in Ecuador's top flight. It shows that there is method to this.
Yeah, and it helps in a way that it's not a big club, because it's hard to be a big club with a great tradition and you're always selling your best players. It's difficult. But if you're someone like Independiente del Valle, you haven't got those populist pressures to deal with, and that makes it easier. Everyone knows you're going to sell. And look at what they did with midfielders. Alan Frankel developed him, sold him to Brazil. In comes Moises Caicedo. Developed him, sold him to Brighton, and they had another one. Pedro Viti came in last year, did very well in a few games. Developed him, sold him, and then another one comes in. They take it really, really seriously. I mean, it's a really serious thing, and they bring in quality European coaches as well. So that's obviously part of it, but other clubs are participating. You can't judge. This one club has produced a lot of the players, but there's other clubs producing players as well. Possibly on the root cause of this huge rise in Ecuadorian football, one of them is they're using many more Afro descendants, and the Afro descendant population of Ecuador is not big. And it's relatively limited to 2 or 3 places in the country, when you go there, when you go to Quito, you don't see that many Afro descendants. But you look at the football teams these days, and they're very, very, very Afro descendant, that has meant, I think, that the best of Ecuadorian football, it has a certain style that uses the physicality of some of these players. I mean, they often play, the Ecuadorian sides, they'll often play on a kind of variation of 4-2-3-1. Looking to make the pitch big, with strong, fast wingers, strong, fast attacking fullbacks, physical strikers as well. So I think that's been part of the rise of Ecuadorian football, tapping into something that they had but they weren't using enough before.
No, that's really curious to hear, because it's something which, from my perspective of Ecuadorian football, which is purely through the players that ultimately end up in the under 20 squads at major tournaments, or ultimately end up in Europe most of the time as a result of those performances. That's quite curious to hear, sort of why there are the reasons which ultimately lead to Ecuador being a success in those competitions. And
Well,
just
it's
to
still a mystery to me how they're able to outproduce Colombia.
Well,
You
yeah,
know,
exactly. As you
demographically
mentioned,
is demographically is the same, and it's so much bigger, and it's football mad, and it's got so many urban centres, and football is the game of the urban centre. But over recent years, Colombia has been a disappointment.
yeah, I think that's probably a separate episode in itself, to try and explore the issues of why Colombia perhaps has been usurped as that production hub. But just, just rattling off the players who've represented Ecuador in the most recent round of fixtures. You got Pervis Estupiñán, who was obviously picked up by Watford at a very early age, did very well at Osasuna in La Liga, now with Villarreal. Angelo Preciado, who's Genk, another Independiente del Valle alumnus. Piero Hincapi, who's at Bayer Leverkusen, Diego Palacios at Los Angeles FC. These are not players who are playing in sort of, in the top 10 or 15 European leagues. These are players who are competing in major continental tournaments, and rightly so, because they've got the building blocks to be able to do that, because of how they've been developed as teenagers. And I think it would be good to get on to the Brighton boys, which is obviously Moises Caicedo, and interestingly enough, Jeremy Sarmiento, who I'd actually quite like to hear a little bit more about how you see him fitting into the national team setup potentially, because obviously Caicedo was signed by Brighton. Was it in January of this year, and I think it's obviously with a view to the future, certainly. But when he was in Ecuador, obviously he was a bit of a revelation, given his age, and the fact that he had a bit of a penchant for a long shot, didn't he, Tim?
Well, that's some of that is altitude, because if you play at altitude, long shots are because the ball that has less resistance in the air, so it flies through the air quicker. So long shots are a real weapon at altitude, and players who play at altitude quite often develop that as a technique. In terms of, I think Moses Caicedo is just a huge promise. I think he's just a magnificent midfielder,
Hmm.
and I'm surprised they've loaned him out. Really, I would have thought that he'd be good enough to compete already. But anyway, I think they know what they're doing. Sarmiento, I know much less about, because he grew up abroad. He
Hmm.
left Ecuador very very young, and suddenly when he was called up, now there was a big fuss about him without anyone really in Ecuador knowing much about him. Uh, this worries me a little bit, because I've seen this in the past
Okay.
with players from other countries. A Peruvian who grew up in Spain and was in the rank, came through the ranks at Real Madrid, Benavente. There was a huge fuss about him. He was going to be this, he was going to be that, he was going to be the other. But a lot of the players who are at youth level at Real Madrid or something, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be in the senior team at Real Madrid. Most fall by the wayside, and I think he was last seen in Belgium, and he was given a few opportunities, but he was never going to live up to the hopes of like a Real Madrid player. And in a way, I think something similar pertains to Sanabria of Paraguay, who
Hmm.
came through the youth ranks at Barcelona, and is now, I think he's now at Torino, and he plays for the Paraguayan national team, and he's probably the best centre forward that they've got. And he missed a penalty last time round, which turned out to be expensive. But again, there have been no signs from him that he's a world beater, and sometimes because these players are at glamorous foreign clubs. And now anything in the Premier League is a glamorous foreign club to the Ecuadorian audience. Sometimes this can heap expectations on them that they're not good enough to live up to.
Yeah, very interesting. With Sarmiento, of course, you're reeling off those names there. Benavente, again, another one which I just completely had just left my brain for about God knows how many years, and now it's trickling back in. But with
Oh,
Ecuador,
if you want to talk about Ecuador, Guerrero. Do you remember
yes,
little Guerrero?
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
one of the very few players who's got both Real Madrid and Burnley on his CV.
yeah. Very few people can count that
Indeed.
themselves. Yeah. Oh, you completely knocked me off track there. I'm now thinking about players who've played for Barcelona and Blackburn. But I think it was the South American Under-20 Championship where I first saw Gonzalo Plata, who subsequently was signed by Sporting Club de Portugal, and hasn't really fit into as in fits and starts, sort of showed why he was so dynamic, so explosive, so exciting at those youth international tournaments. He was obviously another one who was at that Under-20 World Cup in 2019. But I'm curious to know sort of what the consensus is in South America, in Ecuador, over Plata, because obviously I know he plays regularly for the national team, but with his exploits at club level, it seems to be a story of one who maybe unfulfilled potential, maybe a bit. He was seen as being a bit erratic at times at Sporting, and that was something which was of great pain for me, because I thought, this is a player who I've watched at a low level tournament compared to most European spectators. I want to see him make it big, and obviously now, I mean, he's playing at, was it Rio that you mentioned?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not
I,
a bad level, but by no means it's not with a club of the same stature as Sporting, for example.
no, I think there are. He's a huge promise, but I think there are two problems with him. One is that he needs space. And that's harder to come by in European football than it is in South America.
Mm-hmm.
And he's so strong and so powerful, but he is very left-footed. So I think he's probably at his best wide right, cutting in. But it's been easier for him to find space actually playing for the Ecuadorian national team, especially when they throw him on second half, when the opposition are a little bit tired, and he can have a run at them. So I think that's been one problem in European football. Another problem is he's a little bit scatterbrained. He's not really trustworthy, and he's given goals away when he's lost concentration on his marking. Like an idiot, he got himself sent off playing for Ecuador. He scored an absolute cracker, and he's already on a yellow card, so he celebrates by taking his shirt off, and he gets his second yellow for that, and off he goes. But he's certainly one for the future. And after Argentina beat Ecuador in the quarterfinals of the recent Copa America, Scaloni, the Argentina coach, he said to Alfaro, the coach of Ecuador, he said, you've got a generation here that are really special, because it was a game that Ecuador were right in the game until the last few minutes. One of the problems, I think, was a centre-back that you mentioned, Hincapié, who left-footed centre-back, who they're giving extended time to, and I don't think he's quite there yet. And I'm not sure he's going to be. I don't know. I don't really trust him. He's making a lot of mistakes. They've really thrown him in the deep end. I'm surprised he's getting a regular game ahead of Arriaga, who plays in the United States. And the other centre-back, I know 24 is stretching it a little bit for this podcast, but the other centre-back who they've brought in recently plays in Mexico, Felix Torres. I think they've really found one there. I think he looks like he could be he's a giant figure. He could be a defensive rock for them. Hincapié is a little bit iffy, and in the game that they lost, could be important, this one, that they lost to Venezuela recently. They went with that. They've really chopped and changed the goalkeepers, and they went with the goalkeeper from that under 20 side, the 2019 side, Ramirez, who had a little go with Sociedad in Spain, and then came back to Independiente del Valle where he started. And he's live and he's agile, but he dropped an absolute brick when he let a free kick go through his hands, and that cost them the game. So that they are paying a price, I think, for going with so much youth. It's a great live experiment. Some of this Ecuador team, to see how youth copes with pressure.
What's Spanish for Alan Hansen? Because I feel like that could be quite a good quote in there. But it's interesting to hear you to assess them like that, because obviously, I mean, I don't watch every Ecuadorian qualifier. I don't watch every Gonzalo Plata game. I don't watch Pierre Hincapié very often. But it's whenever you do tune into one of those fixtures, you go through the lineup on the internet or whatever, and you go, oh, he's another one who's 19. There's another one who came through Independiente del Valle.
Yeah.
It does pique the interest. So it is very curious to hear what you've got to say on it. Aside from Ecuador in the most recent round of fixtures, and actually, to be honest, throughout the entire qualifying campaign so far, have there been players for you who've impressed you? I mean, I noted down Carlos Cuesta and Fede Valverde, another two players who've got under 20 pedigree, under 20 World Cup pedigree, that is. But are there any others who perhaps who have been 23 or under who've impressed you in qualifying
Well,
across all
I,
of the nations?
I love Cuesta. Cuesta is a player I discovered as a 17-year-old when he was playing for. He came off the bench for Atletico Nacional in a difficult cup game away in Brazil. I think it was against Curitiba. And he came off the bench and he went to right back, and then had a player sent off and he went to centre back, and this was tough, and he just came through brilliantly, and then he played. He was so good that he played in the under 20 championship at the age of 17, and was great. And then played the next one when he was 19 and was great again. And it kind of surprised me a little bit that he went to Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Europeans will look at him and think, well, perhaps he's not quite big enough, and maybe that's a doubt about him. But he looks so classy to me, and I was delighted to see him get in and get a chance. I mean, the story of him getting a chance is brilliant as well, because in those September games, Davinson Sanchez of Tottenham defied Tottenham to come back to South America to play in them, and but he's on a yellow card. So if he picks up another one, he's suspended. And he made very sure that he was suspended from the third game, so he could come home early, and that would smooth things over a little bit with Tottenham. Rather than flying home after the game on the Thursday night, he flew home on the game after on the Sunday. So and the way that he got himself suspended was, it was a game against Paraguay. It's 1-1. It's petering out final stages, and Davo he decides to take every set piece, every goal kick, every throw in, and he takes so long over all of them until the referee just loses patience with him and gives him a booking, and that means he's suspended for the next game. Problem for him is in comes Cuesta, and to pair with the giant Yerry Mina of Everton, I think Cuesta's a better pair than Sanchez. Mina and Sanchez are probably a little bit too similar. Cuesta and Mina, you're a little bit kind of Bobby Moore, Jack Charlton. Then you got a combination.
What a comparison!
And Cuesta did well, 3-1 win over Chile, and he kept his place. So, and the three subsequent games, the three games that we've had this month, Colombia didn't concede a goal, didn't score one either. It was 3-0 draws. But you can't pin that one on Cuesta. But the defensive records, yeah, great. So poor old Davo, he hasn't got in, and Cuesta is now an established international, and he's certainly one that I'm going to be watching, because I've seen him all the way up. And I was a bit disappointed that he ended up going to Belgium. I'm hoping that there'll be better things from him. Looking at some players from other teams, Bolivia is an interesting one, because and Bolivia, they're the weakest side really in South America, but they do have the extreme altitude of La Paz. And what Bolivia did was that under 23 Olympic qualifying tournament at the start of last year, they took that really seriously, and they didn't qualify. They played in a really cavalier fashion because they weren't that worried about conceding. The coach really wanted to develop players, and some of those players are now coming through. They've won the last two games, and they've put themselves in touching distance of getting in the fight. I don't think that they're going to make it to Qatar. They're going to have to pick up some away points. But some of the young players, and there's one I particularly like, a centre back, Jairo Quinteros, who actually grew up in Spain and came up the youth ranks with Valencia. He's moved back to Bolivia. He plays with Bolivar now, but he looks like quite a classy centre back. I think he might be an important player in the national team for quite some time. Other players who've come through recently, little Torres of Uruguay, left-footed playmaker think he's a player with a future. And Peñarol aren't going to be able to hang on to him for much longer. Did very well in the Copa America when his ability to take men on looked good. He's been a bit injured since, so he hasn't featured much for Uruguay recently. But I think little Torres of Peñarol is another player to watch. And happily, they're always coming through. Always. And it's one of the great pleasures that I have. Catching them early, watching them for the under-20s and then following them all the way through.
Oh, definitely. That's one of the best aspects about following youth tournaments is that, you do see players before they do make it big time, and you think you kind of do, you get your hooks in a little bit, and you kind of develop that small amount of attachment, I think, which sometimes is not healthy in my case with Gonzalo Plata, clearly. But thank you very much to you, Tim, for coming on. I think the unrivaled insight has definitely lived up to the hype, because I mean, every day is a school day on this podcast if you're learning about what altitude does to long shots in Ecuador, or to learn about how Gonzalo Plata maybe has pointed the barrel straight at his feet when he's been celebrating goals for the national team. But yeah, thank you very much for giving up your time, Tim.
My pleasure. Hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, it was excellent. And I hope everybody listening enjoyed it as well. We'll be back once again next week with another episode. And this series, the Road to Qatar series, will continue, and we'll roll on with other confederations and other expert guests in the near future. But in the meantime, stay safe, take care. Thank you all for joining us. Bye for now. For player profiles, in-depth features, and exclusive interviews, visit sfhandbook.com to learn more about the best young football players in the world. Football players in the world. Football players in the world.